Are you sure your business is using the best system? Today we're looking at Windows versus macOS to see which one fits your business best. Stick around, you might learn something surprising.
Welcome to the Cyber CEO podcast, where we explore business growth, innovation, and technology with insights from successful entrepreneurs.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Cyber CEO podcast. I'm Haree Patel, and today we're talking about a debate that has been around forever: Windows versus macOS. It's the question that splits businesses and teams. Is macOS the polished choice that creatives love, or is Windows the reliable and flexible system that's hard to beat? We'll cover the pros and cons of each, including which types of businesses might benefit the most. Joining me today is Mus Melemendi, Senior Engineer and Team Lead at ICE Connect. Mus, let's start with the basics. Why do you think so many businesses are hesitant to move from one system to another?
Hi, Harry. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
I think it boils down to three things. The short answer is that most businesses hate change. There's something you may have been using for a really long time and you're hesitant to switch.
Yeah.
What are you familiar with? Is this something that you've trained your whole team on? Will your software work on your new system? The training side of that will take a lot of time, and there's costs involved in that. How long will it take to train your whole team on a new system? So I think there's a lot of intimidation with what you already know.
Yeah, and I think as we've gone over time, 99% of businesses we've worked with have always been Windows-based. And like you said, it's the software which they're used to running on the Windows platform, and changing that around, teaching people all the new stuff, it's going to be almost impossible. The three things you're saying are familiarity with what they're currently using. The second thing is no one really likes change. And the third thing, I think, which is one of the biggest drivers, is compatibility. If your software your business works on doesn't work with the other operating system, then you can't really choose to move anyway, right?
Yep. Now, I think that the compatibility side of it is actually getting better over time. For example, now we have Microsoft, which is completely available from a web-based experience. It doesn't matter which platform you're on. You can go to office.com and you can use your Word, your emails, your Excel, everything as you do on software. So the operating system matters less, but it does still mean that you're outside of your comfort zone. It might not be as familiar, or you might be losing features if you're using the web-based version as opposed to the native software.
I have to slightly disagree on some points there. I appreciate compatibility is definitely getting better. Everything's moving cloud. Most apps now that are being developed are purely developed for cloud. No one's really making desktop apps, and that is for compatibility. It allows you to choose whatever you want. But I don't necessarily think that the cloud version of the software is better, especially when it comes to Microsoft. I'll give you two examples. Microsoft Outlook on the cloud, I absolutely detest it. Microsoft Word and Excel on cloud, I absolutely detest it. It's not as fluid. It's not as easy to use. I find it a little sluggish. That's not to say that's the same for all apps, but definitely for those Microsoft apps, that is the scenario. So I think, like you've mentioned, it is a key driver behind what software you want to use, what you're predominantly going to be using, and how that works, right? So then, if it boils down to software, is it fair to say certain industries are better for certain OSs, Microsoft or Mac OS, should we say?
So I think what we're seeing is that a lot of the creative industry seem to prefer and side with the macOS side of things as opposed to Windows. Everything just seems to work a little bit better. The ecosystem they've created kind of helps creators with that, whereas Windows doesn't seem to have as much of a market share on that side of things.
I think some of the software we're looking at is definitely the Adobe Creative Suite, right?
Yeah.
That looks a lot nicer on the Mac OS than on Windows. And would you think there's anything which you'd say is better running on Windows? I mean, there is the obvious, isn't there?
Something better running on Windows would probably be specialized software. Even with some of our clients, we have people who work on stuff that can only run on Windows. There's no way of making them run on macOS. You could use stuff like Parallels, but that complicates things even further. You're virtualizing the software as opposed to running it natively, and that can go wrong and have its own set of problems.
So to get this right, we've got clients in the finance world, legal world, medical world. There's definitely software they all have which does not run on Mac. That
Correct.
has to run on Windows. Then that question you've just raised could you still run it on a Mac in what's called a virtual environment using third-party software like Parallels? I know you, as well as a couple of other guys in the office, do this a lot, where you have your Macs and you run the software on Parallels so that you can have a Windows environment. My take on that is, why not just use Windows? Because you're going to end up having to fire up some sort of Windows operating system to run that software on your Mac. Why not just use Windows? The difference here now is we've got a generation of people who have grown up using Macs as well, whereas the previous generation hadn't grown up using Macs. Macs in that time was, let's be frank, stupendously expensive in comparison to Windows, a Windows laptop or computer. When you're saying in workplaces you've had all of these Windows devices, most people have just stuck to comfort. They bought a Windows machine for home. It's easier to use, and it's certainly cheaper. I find the newer generation a lot more accustomed to Mac OS, a lot more accustomed to Apple devices, and you'll see that more prevalent, especially in universities. What do you think has been a big driver for change? I feel the cost has come down a lot.
Correct. The cost used to be a lot higher than it is now. One of the most recent examples we can look at is the Mac Mini, and that's come in at a very, very good price. I think a price of around £500 to £600. And that is giving you access to pretty much everything that you would need to get going. Even if you are focusing on something in the creative space that has triple screen support out of the box and everything that you would need to take it from there. The other thing to touch on is, as I mentioned, a lot of the apps going to the cloud means that they're also available on a macOS. So I think that in combination with the ecosystem, for example, if you've got an Apple iPhone, Apple focuses a lot on trying to make sure that you have a seamless experience within their ecosystem. They want you to use their browsers, their phones, AirPods, or whatever it is. But when you do use them, you get rewarded for it. Everything just works so well within each other. I could be using my headphones, come into the office, listening to something on my phone. The moment I open my laptop for a meeting, my AirPods automatically switch to my laptop. I don't have to do anything. It just kind of works.
That is the Apple slogan, isn't it? It just works, right? So just touching on costs a little bit there, the barrier to entry to get an Apple device is still higher than a Windows device. Would I be right?
Yes.
And we're talking mainly for laptops because that's the most mobile thing people want to carry around, especially from a personal perspective.
Yeah.
So if it's still more expensive, you think people are buying into it primarily because of seamless experience, the better experience running an Apple than it is a Windows?
I think so. And I also think that if you are comparing, let's say, £1,000 Apple laptop to a Windows laptop, when you compare them, I do think, yes, there are cheaper Windows-based laptops available. But when you compare them, for example, the hardware, in my opinion, seems to be better quality. The software just works a lot better. There's a lot less glitchiness. But I think a part of this is because of their closed ecosystem. They're designing everything, their operating system, for that piece of hardware. So there's a lot less that could go wrong, whereas Windows has to account for a lot more variability. For example, there's so many different types of hardware. You can custom build your own PC. There's different laptops from different manufacturers that you have to think about. Whereas Apple making their own laptops, they can personalize it, they can optimize it for their hardware.
It almost sounds like we're selling Apple macOS to everybody here.
Look,
I know Apple had a time where they went through where you could actually, they had what's called Intel processors, which meant you could put Windows operating systems directly instead of running Apple. And as of late, they've completely scrapped that. They've done a full U-turn, and now they're controlling the entire hardware of their own equipment, which means you can only run Apple software on their equipment or Apple operating systems on their equipment.
Yeah.
And would you go back to, I know you use an Apple Mac, would you go back to still choosing an Apple right now, knowing that they've now reversed on those decisions and you have to stick to the whole Apple ecosystem?
If I'm honest, at first I was worried about this, but that ultimately ended up being the decision factor for me. That is when I switched to Apple. Their own Apple Silicon ended up being a lot more efficient. I get a full day of battery out of it. It almost felt like they were being held back. Yes, it's even more closed now. But for me, I've never used a laptop that lasts all day. I've had it for 4 years now. It feels like it's as fast as it was on day one, as snappy as it was on day one, and everything just works. So initially, I was worried of what this might mean for Apple, the tech industry, for Windows, but I think ultimately it showed that they were kind of being held back. Now, like you mentioned, it has its own drawbacks. It's broken compatibility for certain things, and it made it even more difficult, like parallels and virtualization. But I think Apple doesn't seem to care too much about that part of it, because they can sell something with better numbers on specification sheet.
Yeah, and I think, like you mentioned, that the big driving factor here is now that all apps are moving towards a cloud-based system, the compatibility question is no longer a major issue as it used to be. So there's no switching you away from Mac now and back to Windows. So you use Windows at work. You use the macOS in your personal life. And I know you are a lot more tech savvy. How do you think the common person might feel about having to make that switch from Windows to Mac at home and Windows at work? Do you think it's easy enough to do? Is Mac quick and easy enough to learn? And vice versa, same question. If you're using Mac and you want to make the switch to Windows, is it an easy enough process?
I mean, it's a complicated answer, because I think if you are looking to switch platforms, whether it's from macOS to Windows or vice versa, you need to make sure you're doing it with an open mind. You can't go into Windows expecting to get macOS type experience or the other way around. You need to be open to the changes. Both of them do things differently. Ultimately, there'll be things that frustrate you with both systems. Something macOS might not do something you can do on Windows as easily, and the other way around again. But ultimately, I think it will depend on what you value. Do you want that seamless experience? Do you have Apple products already? Do you have an iPhone? Do you have AirPods? Do you have anything else that works really well with their other devices? If you haven't bought into that ecosystem just yet, then it might not be as important for you. Whereas for Windows, I don't think the ecosystem matters so much yet.
It's not for want of trying, right? Because
Exactly.
Microsoft did try to launch the Microsoft phone. They've tried to do the Microsoft tablet, which is the Surface. None of them seem to have taken off fully functionally, I would say, as well as Apple have, like the tablets and the phones. So it's hard to argue the point of a better ecosystem out there. I mentioned something there is the Microsoft Surface tablets. That is a product fully built from the ground up by Microsoft. So it's on Microsoft hardware running Microsoft software. And that's their answer to the Apple MacBook. That's them saying, well, Apple designed their own hardware and their own software, and here's what we're giving you. Dare I say it, they're pushing out the other brands. They're pushing out the Dells, the HPs, the Lenovos, and whatever other brand we're talking about in that space, and trying to bring their own brand in. Is that a competing enough product, do you think? The Surface tablets, the Surface laptops compared to MacBooks?
I think the Surface tablets and MacBooks give Microsoft the control over their own product, but I don't think the ecosystem is there yet. The ecosystem is the selling point. The hardware has improved, but it's not competing per se.
So you can't win with Microsoft on performance alone, is what you're saying. Just because it's a faster laptop, just because it might do a lot more, it's not enough, is what you think.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Give me 3 perks, 3 benefits of using a Windows operating system over a Mac OS.
I can do everything on one device right now. If I have one Windows machine at home, I can work from home, and I know all my software for work works for it. I know I can game on it, for example. It's something I do a lot in my spare time. I won't be able to do that on a Mac OS. I tend to delve in a lot of random hobbies, 3D printing, photography, random stuff. I know that every single thing I might possibly consider getting into, chances are the developers have made a Windows-based application for it, and that's their priority. That's the one they're maintaining. That's the one they're focusing on, and everything else is not an afterthought, but it can be, depending on the industry. macOS of a lot of software is just as good nowadays, but again, it completely depends on the industry. There's a few things I've delved into where the software just doesn't exist or isn't up to par or has features missing compared to Windows. So if you want a do-it-all, then Windows is the way to go, I think.
Brilliant. And I'll ask you the same question on Mac OS, but know that we haven't got about 20 hours to discuss it. So maybe give me your top 3 points on what you think is the macOS winner.
macOS winner for me, and I've said this multiple times already. I love the ecosystem. At first I went into it. My first Apple product was the iPhone,
Yeah.
and I went into it and I got an Apple M1 Mac, and that was my second Apple product up to my iPhone. I didn't realize how well everything works with each other, the ecosystem. If I get a call on my phone, I can continue on my laptop and respond to text messages. Everything just works. I didn't have to really set anything up. I just sign in with my Apple account. It's all good to go. The second thing is, I bought the laptop thinking this is the lowest cost device that Apple, lowest cost laptop they're selling. I didn't have my hopes high for it. The specs were, compared to what I could get for the same price with a Windows-based laptop, a lot worse. But I didn't expect that the performance would actually be better. The performance really, really surprised me. And again, that comes back down to their closed ecosystem. It comes back down to the fact that they're selling their own hardware and they don't have to design their OS to run on any other type of hardware. It's purely optimized for that piece of hardware that they're selling. And thirdly, it's a fluid experience. I tried docking my laptop and everything just works. If you're buying a laptop from them, it works better as a laptop. I like being able to use the touchpad. There's a bunch of built-in gestures that feel really natural. But I think, again, if you want to use this on a desktop, you might be better off buying one of their Apple keyboards or Apple mouse or something like the Magic Mouse. You are buying into an ecosystem and you will need to use it the way they want you to.
Okay. So is it fair to say that businesses tend to stick to Windows because it's easier and it's almost the done thing, which has been happening for so many years? Let's say they didn't have to use any proprietary software which only sticks to Windows. They're just going into Windows because that's what's done, because that's what's really been happening for years.
I think one of the main reasons is that security is a big factor here. For example, with a Mac, the device management is nowhere near on the level that you can get with Microsoft. For example, we have things like Intune on the Windows side of things, and it's just, especially from an IT perspective, much easier for us to be able to manage users and manage devices if they're on Windows than if they were based on macOS.
I think that's true when you talk about the Microsoft ecosystem, specifically Microsoft 365. It marries in very well with Windows.
Yeah.
We predominantly support Microsoft 365 in our organization and for our customers. We think it's the better product. Argument for another day. But there are other alternatives out there. There is Google Workspaces as an alternative, for example. Yeah. And could you say that if you're not using the Microsoft ecosystem, Microsoft 365 and Intune, Google Workspaces works better with Mac OS, or is that still impartial between devices there?
I'd say that's still impartial between the devices. But my answer earlier is based on the fact that when I talk about Mac OS, I'm talking about it from the perspective of a user. But from the perspective of an engineer, I would not like to be managing Apple devices. If I'm honest, it would just be a headache. It's a headache to deal with.
Are you saying it's a headache because it doesn't have the granular controls which Windows has, which means we can't apply the restrictions we want? Or is it a headache because it's a lot more difficult to get to work in the way we want?
I think it's really difficult because it's such a closed ecosystem. It is really difficult to get the kind of control we want. Apple end up kicking us out when we're trying to help the user. Now, with the kind of industry we're in, we need to be able to make sure we have the control. Our clients depend on us to have this type of control to fix things when things go wrong. With Apple devices, if something goes wrong, you're almost better off speaking to them and hoping they can help you. But it's going to be a very niche problem and they won't be able to fix your problem. It's going to be a generic knowledge base or something like that. Whereas with Windows, we have the control over the devices. We have a lower level access and we can see everything going on with a piece of hardware and to also troubleshoot it.
Let me bring AI into this conversation. Windows has obviously close tie-ins with Microsoft 365 and now Microsoft Copilot, which is a massive AI engine that they're putting on pretty much a lot of their devices, especially their Microsoft branded devices. Apple has got Siri. Apple's come out with Apple Intelligence. I haven't heard much about Apple integrating that into their Mac OS, whereas Windows is very heavily talking about integrating Copilot into their Windows operating system. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think it's going to come down the road? Is it going to be too late and Microsoft will already have got the ground it's it's taking the lead and leaving macOS in the shadows?
I think it will come a bit too late compared to Microsoft, but we've seen this on multiple occasions. Apple isn't always first with a new feature, but they try to do it in a very Apple way. They might try to perfect it. The AI implementation on their phones, for example, right now is kind of subpar. It feels rushed, which is not on brand with Apple. Normally, they try to make sure they have something perfected. It works really well. And I believe this is the first time they're shipping something with, they advertised the iPhone 16 saying it has AI features, and they sold it to you, but it wasn't even available. It was coming down 3 months down the line. They
Yeah.
marked it as a beta product. It's not out yet. And even now on my phone, it's branded as a beta feature. So
Right.
that's not really on brand with them. I do think they are a bit slow with this, and the implementation they have had so far hasn't been very good with AI, whereas I think Microsoft is implementing AI a lot better right now.
So definitely macOS on the back foot of AI tools. I have an interesting question for you here, and a little controversial, but do you think macOS is more of a status symbol than actually something which is a lot more practical than Windows? Because I know when I was growing up, anyone who had a macOS, it was a very expensive piece of kit back in the
Yeah.
day. And if you had a Mac, it was like, wow, you've got a Mac. You're swinging around a 1,500, 2,000 pound laptop, where
Yeah.
we were swinging around 500 pound laptops from Curry's, with the most basic stuff on there. So is it still a status symbol? Is it still something for the wealthier and deeper pockets?
I think it can be. What surprises me is the fact that Apple can kind of sell you the same product with a much higher price tag and people will still buy it. So we saw instances of them selling monitor screens for £2,000, and technologically on paper, it wasn't any different than something you can buy off the shelf for a quarter of the price, but it had their logo, their brand on it.
Yeah.
Suddenly the price was much higher than it would be normally.
There's still an element of a higher level of status running Macs. And that extends into businesses. I know we've got a lot of city-based hedge funds we work with, and we're starting to see more and more that they're putting in Macs into their environment, whereas previously it was Windows. And I don't know if that's because they genuinely feel that those Macs are better performing. I have noticed where this comes in. The incumbent team, the incumbent staff have always been on Windows. They've never wanted to change, never cared to change. But as they're taking on new members of the team and growing the team, and dare I say it, a younger team, they're all coming in saying, we'd like to work with Macs.
Yeah.
I think there is an age or a generation of people who prefer Macs over Windows. And whether that's a status thing or a familiarity thing, or actually it is a productivity thing, I think time will tell. But we are seeing a shift in the last 12 to 18 months on more Macs.
To add to your comments about the status thing, I did just remember I went somewhere and they had iMacs across all of the reception computers. So I was like, okay, so this is what I'm dealing with today. Went around and all of the iMacs were actually running Windows, but they wanted to display the iMacs in reception. So they were all running Windows, and I don't think they would be able to run macOS on there. They wouldn't want to run macOS on there, but they wanted to display the iMacs in their reception, even though it was running Windows. So I think the status thing definitely has its play.
Absolutely. So let's wrap this up with some actionable items people can walk away with. What do people need to look for in their organization? If they're having this impasse, do I go down the Windows route? Do I go down the macOS route? What kind of tips, advice do you have for people on this?
I think the first thing people need to do is kind of look at, what are they working with? Are they working purely with cloud-based software? Are they working on stuff like Microsoft Word, Excel, and emails? If that's all you need, you have more options available to you. You can look at macOS as an alternative, or Windows if you're already on macOS. But I do think if you're working on cloud-based systems, this is something to consider. If you want a more seamless experience, if you want all your devices to work and you don't mind buying into an ecosystem, this does mean obviously Apple dictating kind of how you should be using your devices and always telling you to buy their devices so that everything works better. But if you do buy into it, you will get the benefits of it. So as I mentioned, especially if you're on the go, it would be beneficial for you to have an iPhone, an AirPods, or one of the Apple devices that work really well with each other. I do think that ecosystem has its benefits if you're on the go.
So touching on the cloud thing, if you have proprietary software which only works on Windows, then the conversation of macOS is a non-starter.
I wouldn't consider virtualizing it or using Parallels or any workaround. Just
Yeah.
won't work as well.
That's the biggest key divider here, isn't it? It's cloud software versus proprietary Windows-based software. Any other things you can think of?
I think on the security side of things, if you really want to be able to tell your IT company, I want hands off, I want you to take control of everything, I do think Windows gives us, the IT engineers, the techies, a lot more control over your devices. If you want to say, I don't want to think about this, take over my full security, I do think that Windows is the way to go there. If you're switching, keep an open mind.
You've pretty much sold macOS to everybody out here, by the way. You know that.
Yep. And if my PC in the office dies, I want a Mac Mini replacement.
I did think about putting a Mac Mini in my house, actually. I thought it's a good way to start learning the Mac, and my home machine stroke laptop is coming to an end. It's about 6 years old, and it's at that point where all the fans inside are wearing away like it's about to take off like a jet engine or something. Jury's out, though. I'm not totally convinced just yet. I don't know what's holding me back from switching from Windows to Mac. I think it's the not wanting change. It's not wanting to have to learn something new. I'm very quick at using Windows. I can get things done instantly. I know where everything is. That change is a big fear of mine on switching from Windows to Mac personally. That's what's holding me back.
I feel like you're done with your tinkering phase, Harry. If you switch to macOS now, you're gonna run out of patience, and you don't want to try figure it all out. Everything just works for you already.
Yeah.
The only way you would switch to macOS is if Windows pushed you away, and I don't think that's going to happen.
No, I always ended up finding an excuse of why I needed Windows. I remember about 2-3 years ago, I spoke to you guys, and it was, my accounting software is Windows only, so until that moves to cloud, I can't move it. And that moved to cloud, and now I've got nothing really which is proprietary Windows apart from me, myself, and I. I've been using Windows since MS-DOS, and then it became Windows 3.1. I've been using it since its very first iteration. You're too young to know what Windows 3.1 is, don't worry. I'll show you some screenshots if I can find it. But look, I absolutely do love Windows. I think it's a great product. It's getting better and better. Windows 11 is probably one of the best operating systems they've come out with. And a lot of it has started to work like Mac. I had a friend of mine, and the one thing he said to me was, should I go for Windows or Mac? And I said, look, Windows is just as good. He came out to me and said, look, the one thing I love when I see people use Mac is they flip the lid open and it's almost instantly starting to work.
Yep.
With Windows, you flip the lid open, you've got to wait 10 minutes for it to load into the OS and get your logins and everything, and then it's still firing up in the background. I think the only reason that worked on the Mac was the performance of the hardware. When you buy a £2,000 Mac versus a £500 Windows laptop, you can't expect the same level of performance. If you buy a £2,000 Windows device, I think you can get to that same level of seamless activation, seamless instant on kind of stuff. I do know when my laptop was first brand new, I did have that level of open it and it just works. But my laptop's now, like I said, 5-something years old, and it takes a little while longer to start up. But jury's out. I'm not making any decisions on Windows or Mac just yet for my next device. That's it for today's episode. A big thank you to Mus for joining me to break down Windows versus macOS for business. I hope we've got you some useful insights into the strengths and weaknesses of both platforms and which one might work best for your needs. If you'd like to talk about your tech setup or want some free advice, visit thecyberceo.com. We're always happy to help.
Thanks for tuning in to the Cyber CEO podcast. If you found value in today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with fellow entrepreneurs. For more tips on tech and business growth, visit our website, thecyberceo.com. Keep innovating, and see you in the next episode.